Today, we're blessed with a first-hand account of the Shroud of Turin research project in 1978, plus a lot more. Stick around. I'll be right back. Greetings, gracious gang. It's Mike Creevy from thegraciousguest.org here with you for another episode of The Gracious Guest Show. If you're unfamiliar with this show, this is where we kind of look at all things faith and culture. We try to ultimately live with wonder and awe by pushing back against some of the more relativistic and kind of reductionist trends that are kind of inundating us each and every day in so many ways, getting us to sort of lose sight of what we really are, what we're really called to, what our relationship with God really is and is meant to be. And in order to do that, we kind of look at all kinds of things around here, from literature to movies. We have conversations, we have interviews. There's all kinds of content that I think will really benefit you. So if you haven't subscribed to this channel already, please do that. Please click that little thumbs up down there and share this interview, I would ask, in a particular way with anyone you think might benefit from this. I really appreciate that. Today, I'm delighted that we have two guests on here today, Dr. Kenneth E. Stevenson and Dr. Brian Donley Worrell. Dr. Stevenson was the official recorder for the 1978 Shroud of Turin research project, where several dozen scientists, largely from this country, were able to go over to Turin and to investigate the shroud. They got special access, and they got a series of a couple days there to really do a tremendous amount of hyper-sophisticated scientific inquiry into the shroud. It's often said that the Shroud of Turin is the most studied and sort of researched artifact in the history of the world, and a lot of it goes back to what Stirp did in 1978. So this is my first opportunity to speak with someone from the original team, which was just a tremendous honor. Just by way of some biographical background on my two guests here today, Dr. Kenneth E. Stevenson was an Air Force Academy graduate and then served with distinction in the Vietnam War with the Strategic Air Command as a B-52 co-pilot. He volunteered for combat duty in Southeast Asia and amassed over 1,200 combat flying hours and 210 combat missions. He received 10 air medals and 3 distinguished flying crosses for his service, also advanced to command his own B-52 crew at the age of 25 and was one of the youngest commanders in Strategic Air Command. He then returned to be a professor at his alma mater of the United States Air Force Academy, which is where he met Dr. John Jackson, Dr. Eric Jumper, and this carpool that he discusses here began and really led to the Shroud of Turin research project. So we're going to get more into that later. Dr. Stevenson lectures far and wide. He holds degrees also in theology. He is a pastor, and if for me to just share his biography with you would probably take most of this time because he's a truly remarkable man, and he has tirelessly been teaching and writing about the Shroud. He has written many, many books about the Shroud. I've got a bunch of links below you're going to want to check out. And then we also have Dr. Brian Donley Worrell, who works with Dr. Stevenson very closely on all things Shroud. He is a former Fortune 500 vice president with a strong background in chemistry, internet technology, business development, and blockchain technology. His multilingual skills served as an important tool for his work in international business development and program management. With a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry, much of his postgraduate work focused on the disparate areas of various technologies and biblical sciences, culminating with his PhD in biblical studies. So, I'm delighted to have Dr. Stevenson and Dr. Worrell with us here today. I think you're really going to love this interview. And just before anybody comments on this, I just want to mention this up front and sort of sing the praises of Dr. Worrell here, because I had all these plans to try to split things up and even things out as much, and Dr. Worrell was very kind and so humble in his emails with me. He's such a tremendously respectful man and is so delighted to work alongside Dr. Stevenson, who himself was, of course, on the original Shroud of Turin research project, that Dr. Worrell was insistent that he said, you really want to talk to Dr. Stevenson. You really want to, sort of do the best you can to exhaust your time with him because of all of his experience with the Shroud. So I don't want anyone to think I was shortcutting Dr. Worrell at all. He was very insistent that I take advantage of this opportunity. So I do have several parts in the interview where I ask him for his input and like to get his take on some things as well, for sure. So, but I just wanted to mention that and mention he is truly a humble man. So I want to thank both Dr. Stevenson and Worrell for being with us today. So let's jump right into this interview on the Shroud of Turin Research Project and all things Shroud with Dr. Kenneth E. Stevenson and Dr. Brian Donley Worrell. Enjoy. So Dr. Kenneth Stevenson and Dr. Brian Donley Worrell, thank you so much for coming on the Gracious Guest Show.
It's really great to be here. Thanks for having us.
And this is exciting because I as this often happens, just being anyhow connected to the Shroud community, you'll talk to someone, they'll say, "Oh, you should talk to so and so. You should talk to so and so." And so I don't remember exactly who it was who initially connected me. I think it was my friends down there in Texas, Dr. Stevenson specifically over at the Pilgrim Center for Hope up there. My friend Angela, and and Nan, they're doing that exhibit there. And so, but I'm delighted to have you both on here. And I just wanted to ask you, how whatever order you want to go in here, just to maybe share with the audience a little bit about your own background and especially how the Shroud entered into your life.
Well, I'll start. Basically, I first saw the Shroud at a Catholic discussion group or retreat many years ago. It was an item of interest, but I never for a moment dreamed I'd be involved. I was at the Air Force Academy at the time. Following my duty in Vietnam, I was assigned for a master's to go back to the academy and teach, where I ended up in a carpool with a physicist, an electrical engineer, and an aeronautical engineer. And we had an interesting discussion one day about faith. And the electrical engineer was very adamant that he was an agnostic and that if God gave him such a scientific brain, God would surely reveal himself through science. At which point the physicist mentioned the Shroud. And both the aeronautical engineer and I had heard of it. Of course, we chimed right in. And he said, well, has it ever been studied? The answer, of course, was no. And he said, well, if it was ever studied and proven or tested and shown to be accurate, then maybe I would believe. Since you've read Nazar, you've seen what he has to say now. His name is D. German, and he's in the front of Nazar. From those four guys in that carpool was birthed the Shroud of Turin Research Project. My background with the master's in English and my undergraduate degree in engineering, I was perfectly suited to be their editor and their spokesperson and their recording secretary. And that's how I got involved, literally. I reached a point in my Air Force career where, although I was at the top of my career in every respect, I went in for a review. And the review read like I was Superman, and it was very nicely written. And then the officer who wrote the review said, now, if you want the rating that you have earned, you need to drop the Shroud. Mm-hmm. And I said to him, why? You're getting great press. Look at my reviews. Look what I'm publishing, on and on and on. And he said, the Shroud is hokey. That's a quote. I don't know what became of him. I left the Air Force. I have never regretted it. God has had his hand on my life ever since. Interestingly enough, I gave up flying at that time because the airlines weren't hiring for the most part. And if they were, you couldn't afford to live on the wages that they were paying a starter pilot. So even though I had massive experience, that was not in the cards. I joined IBM. And 3 years later, when I wrote Verdict on the Shroud, IBM came looking for me, said, we understand you're a pilot. How'd you like to come fly our jets? So I always say it was like God said, thank you for writing that book. Now go have some fun, fly some jets.
That's good. And what year was that carpool, that initial conversation
The carpool
happened?
was in 1976. by early 77, the Shroud of Turin Research Project was pretty much uh, put together as a unit. It basically was other scientists from NASA Jet Propulsion Lab, Los Alamos, Sandia. We're talking not, as some have presumed, a religious group at all.
Right.
It was different scientists, and they had a conference in New Mexico, which was called the 1977 Proceedings of the U.S. Conference of Research on the Shroud of Turin, which was my privilege to edit. And we took that and the three dimensional to Italy and got our foot in the door, and rest, as they say, is history.
Hmm. Very good. And we're going to talk a lot more about how that went,
Yes,
as
of
much as we can
course.
in this forum. But Dr. Worrell, how about you?
Well, I would say, privileged to first hear of the Shroud when I was probably, I would say, a young teenager, and it sounded very interesting to me. Um, I'm the type of person, and Dr. Stevenson will probably laugh when I say this. I'm a little bit of a type A personality, just a little.
Yes, I will laugh.
So I'm one of those people who, and I've been this way since I was a child. I always want to find out, oh, that sounds good, but is this real? Am I just hearing
Mhm.
something like Santa Claus or something else people make up? And
Right.
so at that time, I really was not positioned to do a lot of in depth study. And as Dr. Stevenson stated earlier, there really had been no in depth analysis or study of the Shroud at that time. So I'd heard about it. I was lacking any level of detail or specificity about it. And I would say in later years, I would hear of it again. And, it's one of those things that you just hear about, but there's really not a lot of data that you can really decide, oh, this is real, or, oh, here's another Loch Ness monster, so to speak.
Right.
So,
Right.
anyway, after college, my undergrad degree is in chemistry. I then went into the Fortune 500 and proceeded, quote unquote, up the ladder, so to speak, and started doing a lot of work internationally, and decided to go back to school and finish up my doctorate in biblical studies and theology. So while I was while I was writing my doctoral thesis, a gentleman at our school said, "Hey, there's a fellow who is a doctorate, and he's writing a book on a subject. And I wonder if you would take a look at the book and just really give me an overall overview, analysis, etc. of the book." And I agreed to do so. And that book actually was the fifth book or fourth book. Correct me if I'm mistaken,
Fifth.
Dr.
Mm-hmm.
Stevenson. The fifth
Hmm.
book written by Dr. Stevenson himself. That book is entitled Nazah, which I'm sure you have a copy of as well.
Hmm.
And so I was privileged to read a pre-release version of that book and gave my comments on the book. I thought it was everything I had ever wanted in terms of the level of information and specificity and factual
Mm.
information that I had always sought. I thought it was the
Right.
best book I had ever read on the subject. And I wrote my remarks about the book. And interestingly enough, my remarks were actually included on the very first page of that book. If you look in that book, you'll see Dr. Brian
Oh,
Donley
yep.
Worrell on the first page. So that's how I really came to it. And in reviewing that book, that's how I really got to know Dr. Stevenson, and we've been close both professionally and personally ever since.
Oh, very good. Yeah, and this it really does sometimes strike me as kind of a family, right? Sometimes, and
It
there,
really
there's,
has become that.
you know,
It's
Yes.
yeah.
I just finished speaking in Houston with Barry Schwartz, our photographer, Rudy Dichtel, one of our physicists. But while I was there were no fewer than two people that I've spoken to over the years who are now working on getting their own shroud exhibits. One in
Hmm.
Alabama, and another person who
Wow.
fostered getting the shroud into the Museum of the Bible, and it was there only temporarily. But then she moved it into I don't know the name of the building, but it's operated by the Catholic diocese there. And this is someone I talked to years ago, never thinking the impact it would have. So it has become very much like a family. I could tell you stories of people that I've spoken to. There's a young man now who's making they're silver like amulets or something with the 3D of the shroud.
Hmm.
Turned out his mother took him to a presentation that I gave as a young man. He grew up and became a silversmith and was so fascinated that he started
Wow.
creating these objects so that people could see what he saw. It's like that.
Yeah. That reminds me of the friends of this show I've had on before. The Let Your Light Shine, 3D night lights that Julie and Sheila they came on to talk about that, and that's we have one here, and every time I'm just wash my hands and see it, it's just such a that's because we'll get into some of the details here, some of the really interesting. I almost hate to use that word; it doesn't seem to do it justice, but some of the really just jaw-dropping, eye-opening, truly
Yes.
profound mysteries about the shroud. But by the same token, I think sometimes just the simple and so profound reality of that face, it gets me every time to just look at that
Over my
face
shoulder, if
and
you can see it,
yeah.
is the 3D bust of the shroud.
Mm,
I have carried that with me as I've traveled. Invariably, people
mm,
immediately recognize it as Jesus. And they'll say, "That's
wow.
amazing. Where did you get it? How do you?" Well, it opens up the door for you to share. And they said, "But it's three
Right.
dimensional." Yes, that happens to be one of the most exciting characteristics of the shroud image. The image on the surface fibers of those threads is encoded in such a fashion that it's literally possible to recreate the distance the body was from the cloth at any given point.
Hmm.
Incredible, incredible,
Wow.
and one of a kind, period.
Wow. Well, let me ask you this, Dr. Stevenson, as far as when you actually get on the ground over there, it's what's the time frame again? So 1978.
Yes.
You want to just give us the kind of when did you land? What was it like? I understand there were some challenges to say the
Oh my
least with
goodness. Well,
getting everything
let's
through.
start at getting there. We did a dry
Sure.
run a few months before, and I had proposed to then Harry John, who was the head of the Durance Corporation. He was the one who eventually funded the trip over, but we had multiple $1 million worth of space age technology, and we literally were waiting at the last minute to see if he was going to come through and pay for the trip, and that's an absolute truth. And what ended up happening, he paid, but just before we left, and I'm going to tell you a couple of stories to make a thread here. Just before we left, I get a call from Rolling Stone magazine. And
Huh.
the author of one of the best articles on the shroud, Michael Thomas, is calling me to tell me, do I really need to go? I don't know if I believe this. I think it's going to be a waste of time.
Oh, is that?
Oh, there it is.
There you
And I said,
go.
you come and you won't regret it. So there's a picture of
Wow.
us at the airport in New York. And I'm telling everybody, I said, our picture is going to be on the cover of the Rolling Stone. So we got a big joke out of that. Then we get there, and several things happened. First of all, we had a press conference and all kinds of inquiry about what we were doing, whether or not we were a religious project. Well, guess whose
Right.
job that was as the spokesman? That was mine. Um,
Hmm.
Michael Thomas ended up being an ally, not only an ally, he ended up babysitting our kids while we were there because several of us
Oh
brought our
wow.
children along. So
Oh
here's
wow.
what happened first. The Italian authorities had never seen equipment like this. Again, much of it a spinoff of space technology. So
Right.
they quarantined it. And we had a limited time to be there. And the late father, Peter Rinaldi, who just happened to be a friend of the king of Italy, the exiled king Umberto II,
Comes in
who
handy.
owned the shroud. The Italian authorities who guarded the shroud, connected to the church, didn't care that the American scientists were there.
Hmm.
But the king said, let them in. And so they pulled up in this huge truck, and you can see our wives dictating which box goes where. And there we were. We set up in the rooms that they used to house the visiting royalty from other royal families. And the saddest part of all, because we had to prove before going that we would in no way damage the shroud. We had to prove it. They subjected linen to 10 times the amount of radiant energy we were going to use in our non-destructive testing to demonstrate we wouldn't harm it. They brought it to us thumb-tacked down to a plywood board. You could literally see the rust stains on the linen from the thumbtacks. The most disturbing thing of all. But then 6 24-hour days just about. I think Barry says it's a little over 5. I always remembered it to be 6 for whatever reason. And it was around the clock, like a space shot. Each test depending on another test. We finished one test, the next test would be lined up. We did infrared, X-ray, every form of non-destructive testing that was known at that time. And we submitted it to more testing than any other archaeological artifact in the history of the world.
And so you just have a few days there to do that. But I think what a lot of people don't know is that it's you didn't have, conclusive. I mean, so you subjected to those tests to get all that data, and then you continue. The team continues to then
It took
study
us
and
3.5
go
years.
down that path for years, right? Yeah.
It took us 3.5 years to analyze, collate, get peer review, because again, people have the misunderstanding this was some kind of religious group. It wasn't. Most of the guys thought it was a fake, and they figured, give us about 5 or 10 minutes and we'll figure out how this thing was created. And it turned out not to be so. So at the end of 3.5 years, with all the things that we did and the peer review and the sessions, I have a shoebox full of micro cassettes of all of the meetings that we had discussing what we learned in those 6 days. And at the end of that 3.5-year period of time, the conclusion was, this is an authentic burial garment of a man who was crucified, crowned with thorns, pierced in the side. In short, a man whose death, burial exactly matches what the Gospels tell us of Jesus. But then they said, we have no idea how the image was formed. And unless future tests reveal that, it's going to remain a mystery. And that pretty much, I think, shook the world up.
Right. Well, and what always strikes me too so much is that I try to get this across to my high school students, who I typically kind of share a basic version of a lot of this with each spring right before Easter. And the thing I was trying to get across to them that was really striking me recently was that it's not just that it matches everything that Christ goes through in his suffering and death. It's as far as we know from all of our historical records, he's the only one that this specific set of injuries were inflicted upon. And I think some people miss that point sometimes too.
It's incredible because there's no other recording of someone being crowned with thorns, pierced in the side. It was traditional to break the legs. His legs aren't broken. And what I clearly state, and I make this clear when I give my presentation, if you don't believe the shroud is real, that's fine. But at the end of my presentation, you will definitely understand what it cost Christ to go to the cross in your place. And what I generally conclude with is, okay, it's accurate historically, it's accurate anatomically, it's accurate medically, it's accurate scientifically, it's accurate scripturally. So if it's accurate in all those details of his death and of his burial, is it possible that the image is there because it's accurate in his resurrection?
So is there, when correct me if I'm wrong, I'm getting my years mixed up. If it was 82 or 83 that your final report was concluded, that you had
October 81
term, the finished product. 81. Oh, 81. Okay.
October 81, and verdict on the shroud came out that month.
Okay,
that was my first book.
And so how was the next? How did the next few years? How did you find those years in terms of because I've heard other folks sharing, from afar. I haven't spoken with them personally, but how those next few years really went in terms of how well it was received in different presentations or just different folks that you were sharing that kind of cutting edge discovery with.
It really sparked a lot of debate about why there was no carbon dating test. And as we now know, the carbon dating test that was done was not only hopelessly flawed, but corrupt. corrupt to the core. But what ended up happening is it finally took the shroud, in my opinion, out of obscurity and at least put it in front of everybody. Now, what muddied the waters is when they came down with this bogus dating and said, this is what triggered most of us. They said it was a fake. Now, had they said it's medieval, but it is real, that would have been a different statement. Because remember, we had already concluded it was a genuine burial garment. No, they came out and said it was a fake without any offering of what scientific evidence convinced them that it was a fake. And so for most of us, it was we were left scratching our heads. I remember Ray Rogers, the late Ray Rogers, who was our chemist, and he said, I don't understand. I really can't comprehend. And before he died, he was one of the first to prove that the reason the date was slewed is they primarily dated cotton that had been woven in to the area of the fabric that they dated. But that dating so muddied the waters that to this day, I'll go and someone will say, yeah, didn't they prove that was a fake? No, they didn't prove it was a fake.
Right.
Quite the contrary.
Well, and that strikes me as, that had to feel, I don't want to say like a personal attack. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But for the way you were just saying it, that interests me. The idea of to just be so dismissive in the way that whole press conference went, that to basically, and knowing full, in my opinion, for what it's worth, knowing full well how the whole media machine works, and how that's going to hit headlines, and that's going to be a very popular sort of thing, as it of course was. It strikes me as just shocking how much of an affront, really, in a lot of ways, to all of your professional integrity that must have been too, to just so dismissively, like, right off, like everything you all did is just, well,
Yeah, it's fake. And I'll take it a step further. One of the things that really made it personal to me, very personal to me, I had taught in some of my classes the writings of apologist Josh McDowell. And his book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, he quotes author Peter Stoner, estimating that if it would take 1 times 10 to the 17th power for any other person in history to fulfill the prophecies surrounding the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus. And I wrote him and I said, are you aware that all of the ones that he cites are fulfilled on the shroud? So he wanted to meet with me, and he met with me. And instead of it becoming a meeting of 2 Christian brothers discussing the evidence for the resurrection, it became an interrogation session with him and 2 other guys interrogating me. Ask me how I know about interrogation. I taught it at the Air Force Academy. But anyway, and he ended up he wrote a book, and he just really lambasted me in his book. He basically said that I was emotionally involved, which discredited any effort of being objective or scientific. But I was used to it by then. National Geo did a great article. Every single word in that article came through me. But if you read that article, my name isn't there. And when I saw that, I called them up and said, hey, guys, my name isn't in the article. Why? I'll never forget what he said. You're a Christian. You can't be objective. Excuse me? Please explain to me how an agnostic or an atheist is objective.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's there's a double standard out there for sure that we're up against.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you, Dr. Worrell, I want to ask you real quick here, as far as, so you mentioned your interest. Was your interest primarily through the chemistry lens? Because you had mentioned that. So I'm just curious, as far as what really kind of drew you maybe to an interest in the shroud, and kind of the timeline here of that compared to like the shroud dating and some of those controversies.
Yes, my interest initially was spurred, I'd say, in a more general sense. As I said, I'm one of those people who I really like to find out if something is real. And if I'm going to determine whether or not it is real, I'm going to have facts. I'm going to have every bit of information I can. I relate all that information and say, this actually adds up very well. And I mentioned that to piggyback on what Dr. Stevenson said, I want to use the word flawed, but I really want to say corrupted. The corrupted, intentionally corrupted, in my humble opinion, carbon dating of the Shroud, it really affects me as a scientist because I mentioned my undergrad degree is in chemistry. The first Fortune 500 job I had was working in the computer applications research lab of a Fortune 500 company. So I have quite a background in science.
Right.
One of the first things you learn as a chemist is reproducibility. Everything that you do, you have to be able to reproduce it again later to be able to prove it is true. So when I read the accounts of how the dating was done and how it was set up, everything inside me just said, wait, none of this is going to work. And sure enough, it didn't. It gave you fake and false results. So from that aspect, as a chemist and a scientist, I was highly angered by it because as a scientist, you have the ability to have access to and to analyze information and data which no one else has or can really interpret.
Yes.
Therefore, it is incumbent upon us
Right.
to be truthful and honest in what we're seeing. We're not to take data and say, let's make it look another way, or let's take 10% of it and say XYZ. In fact, if the data is going to show that this piece of linen is about 2,000 years old, let's find a way to get some data that can make it look like it's not 2,000 years old. And that's honestly what happened.
Well, and why was I didn't mention this in notes ahead of time to either of you here, but I'm just curious because I don't remember the exact date, but my understanding is that the raw data wasn't made available. And I think then only by Freedom of Information Act kind of forcing the hand, if I remember correctly. But wasn't that just in the last maybe 6-7 years, something like that? I mean,
Probably
very recently.
even less than that. It's been the last few years.
Okay.
It was by force
Yeah.
of the Freedom of Information Act. And what was revealed is exactly what Dr. Brown was talking about, where they didn't even utilize all the data they collected. If the data didn't match what they wanted to get, they slewed it out. And the fact of the matter is there was an unofficial dating of the Shroud. I'm aware of it. Many of the members of STIRP were aware of it. The reason it was never brought forth was because there was no unbroken chain of custody. We didn't follow the standard scientific path that should have been followed, and so therefore it would have been criticized. But that unofficial dating came out with 2,000 years. I wasn't surprised at all. None of us were.
Was that? Did you? I think I read in one of your books. Was that was early, right? Was that 80,
yes, it was early on.
1 or 2 or something? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, it was early on.
Okay.
Maybe even before that. I know that we knew about it when we were still all talking together. And unfortunately,
there's been. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Unfortunately, most people will never even see that. And now, one of the things that has been mentioned is if there ever is a chance to carbon date again, maybe they'll go back to the original protocols that we established and therefore give a more favorable response to the results. I would expect the results to come in at about 2,000 years.
Well, and I didn't mean to interrupt there, but I was just going to say, I mean, even just Googling a little bit, there's plenty of papers, and some of them might be, in early phases of peer review. They may not be certain, there's different theories and stuff out there, but I've seen multiple other tests that use different methods to attempt to date it, which a lot of people forget about, and some are newer than others, but in different fields and different sort of disciplines to get an idea. And every one of those I've seen puts it somewhere within a reasonable range of Christ's. Christ's
I
life.
think
And
that's
so,
absolutely correct. One of the things that is forgotten is the first person who pointed out that this cloth was very, very old wasn't one of the members of the team at all. She happened to be a textile expert. And she came to Ray Rogers, our chemist, and she said, there's something called invisible reweaving. Ray Rogers said, you're nuts. I mean, he basically thought she was, out to lunch there. But then she
Mm,
gave him some information, and he decided to do a test. Lo and behold, it was cotton. And since then, they found out some of the materials that were used to dye the cotton, so it looked like the linen. So many
right.
things like that. And the fact of the matter is, since its known history, its documented history is so clear, and since we have these historical images that date way beyond its documented history, come on, um,
Mm.
you're really clutching at straws to come out and say it's medieval.
That's been a really fun sort of rabbit hole I've gone down on a couple programs with a couple different guests into some of the theories about specific facial feature marks. Well,
Yes,
very, very specific marks. We go with the Byzantine coins and certain the religious
right.
art, aspect is a really neat study too, for sure.
Absolutely. I don't know if you've seen it, but there's a Byzantine coin that has the image of Christ Pantocrator on it. And if you do a matched image of the shroud face with that coin and you size them the same, you will see that whoever minted that coin knew the shroud. There's no doubt.
Mm,
It's a part of my presentation that I do. And I think if I could turn this into a course, I would love to do that and have it given at colleges or seminaries or whatever, because
mm,
the amount of detail um, that we know, for
right.
certain, is overwhelming. And I always tell people, don't look at one aspect of the shroud. So some guy comes along and says, well, see, I painted this and it looks like a negative. The
Mm,
negative is the easiest quality to reproduce since we have cameras. Duh.
mm,
With the shroud was known 600 years before the invention of the camera at the very,
right.
latest. So, but it's 3D, and I have never ever ever seen a produced image that is 3D like the shroud.
Mm.
Nothing that's ever been presented is 3D. So look at everything. Look at the fact
Well,
that pollen was found.
yeah.
Look at
I
the
was just going to say
fact that,
let's go there. Let's go down the list here
right.
a little because I'm curious what both of you really what are some of the real kind of home run things, so to speak, that that really jump out at you in particular that are particularly interesting or even astonishing.
When we were there, the late Dr. Max Fry, criminologist, botanist, used by, I forget the name of that European criminal group, but he is one of their
Is it
key guys.
Interpol
Yeah,
or is that okay?
he often was called in. Let's say a murder was committed in France, and they arrested the suspect in London. And of course, I was in London. And they call Max Fry, and he does a vacuum sweep of the guy's clothing and finds pollen from France, from the neighborhood where
Mm-hmm.
the murder occurred. That's him. So I got to
Mm.
tell you this story. We're all there. He's one of the few non American team members allowed in during the testing. And he takes some cellophane tape and you can literally see the shroud come up off the platform, and most of us are like, our heart in our throats that he's going to destroy it. Now we had Kodak develop a non-pressure applicating $7,000 a roll tape, $15,000
Mm.
applicator. I mean, it cost a fortune back then. And
Yeah.
we rolled it onto the shroud, and you never saw the shroud move. Guess who got pollen and who didn't? He found pollen from Turkey. We believe the shroud was in Turkey. He found pollen from Jerusalem. And he begins to dictate where these pollens are from. One of the most fascinating things to me is that one of the pollens that was identified is only found in the area around Jerusalem, and
Mm.
that plant is only pollinating in the month of Nisan, the month when Christ was crucified. I mean, come on.
Yeah. Dr. Worrell, how about you? Anything that just really got your attention, right from the get-go, or something you've learned even more recently that's particularly fascinating?
Well, there are quite a few. I would say, to me personally, I think the uh, the three dimensionality of the image, if you really understand how that comes about, people think three dimensionality, they tend to think, oh, well, it's because if you take, let's say, a piece of fabric and dip it in paint, or you take a paintbrush and put it on some fabric, you think, oh, well, the paint's going to do what? Soak into the fabric. It'll soak in more in some places, soak in less in other places. But with the three dimensionality of the shroud, all of that information is on only the uppermost fibers of the threads within the shroud. So, in fact, for people who say, oh, it was painted, physiologically impossible. And some of it's
Hmm.
just common sense. If you put a liquid paint or any other kind of liquid dye or powder or anything on a piece of fabric, a piece of linen, what's it going to do? It's going to soak into the fabric. But
Right.
that simply is not the case with the shroud. That and as Dr. Stevenson alluded to, the different types of pollen from the different countries and areas that were found on the shroud, that was of great interest to me as well.
Sure.
I
Well, and I
also
did
want to
want to ask
point
about
out, you
the
mentioned
blood.
it
Oh, yes, go ahead.
briefly. It's only superficial. Let me tell you how superficial it is. It's on the upper curved surface of the fibers themselves. And if you take one of those fibers and snap it, it's white at its core. If we
Hmm.
backlight the entire shroud, the image disappears. The blood stains don't. Why? Because they penetrate,
Right.
they soak through. And let me add, wherever there's blood, there's no image, which means the
Right.
blood was there first, and the blood attenuated whatever the image formation process was.
Right. Well, let me ask you this, because this was just something I thought about recently, and I don't remember if I read something about it somewhere or not. I think I did, but a particularly interesting thing to me is with the blood stains, as I understand it, there's no there's no smearing or any indication. Like I've described to students, I said, not getting too graphic, but telling them, if you get a cut or something, or your shirt is over it and
Mm-hmm.
it sticks to it, and then if you have to pull that off, it makes a mess and everything. That there doesn't seem to be any of indications of that whatsoever. Meaning, this you can't just say that this was a body wrapped that was unwrapped and then the
Correct.
body's taken away real quick for grave robbers, because you would see the signs of that on the cloth. Is that a fair thing to to point out?
Absolutely.
Or
That's absolutely fair. You can also point out that the blood is not, as most aged blood would be, dark, almost black. The blood still contains a lot of its red coloration. There is something that transpired in that blood that set the color, if you will. And
hmm,
so, again, we have a very unique situation. There's also evidence of serum albumin. This man definitely went through a horrific torture to see that evidence in the bloodstains. The blood from the wound in the side, serous fluid surrounds it. It not only surrounds the side, but it goes around to the back of the image. Blood and serum do not separate in the body until after death.
hmm, hmm,
What does the scripture say? The soldier wanted to be sure he was dead, and he put the spear in his side, and there came out blood and water, serous fluid.
right. I did hear somewhere too that if I'm understanding correctly, I know the wounds match on the head of the
Yes.
shroud with the sudarium as well,
Mm-hmm. That's what I've
and the
been
blood
told.
type. But I also heard somewhere, I want to look into this more, but I heard somewhere else that there's also evidence on there of additional fluids and spit and things like that match as well, that you can't see with the naked eye.
I wouldn't be surprised at all. I'm not an expert on the Sudarian.
Yeah.
Men that I respect have done a lot more studies in that area and do say there's a match. I do know on the shroud there were particles of dirt in the nasal area and on the feet,
Hmm.
and we would expect that. He fell with no ability to break the fall. The nasal cartilage is separated. There's so many
Right.
things, like there's a bruise that almost has the eye swollen shut.
Hmm.
One of the things that fascinated me early on is I did look into Jewish burial custom.
Yeah.
Gospel said Jewish burial custom was followed. Sometimes Christians have the mistaken idea that Jesus was wrapped like a mummy. He
Hmm.
wasn't.
I've heard that a lot. I've heard that in the
It's
comment threads
it's
on some of these
absolutely not.
videos.
The linen strip
Yeah.
theory is absolutely bogus.
Hmm.
I went to a Messianic rabbi by the name of Eliezer Urbach. Turns out he was the founder of what is now Chosen People Ministries.
Hmm.
And I went to him and I said, this is what we have. Some people say it doesn't match Jewish burial custom. He pointed to me how it does match Jewish burial custom. He told me to get a hold of a book called Code of Law. I got Code of Law. Everything I saw in there confirmed that it does match the Jewish burial custom. To postulate that he was wrapped like a mummy and that because of the amount of myrrh and aloes that was used, that mummy case would set up like a cast,
Right. Yeah.
and that what they saw when they went into this tomb was this empty mummy case. Wait a minute. Don't you remember that when Jesus called Lazarus from the tomb, he was able to come forth? And I
Hmm.
actually heard someone suggest that that was because Jesus levitated his body out of the tomb. Give me a break. How far do you
Yeah.
have to go
Yeah. That's the
to
right.
stretch, you know,
Well,
unbelief?
and Lazarus is in there for 4 days. Not
Yes,
even through. So it should be even more firm and set and rigid. And yeah.
exactly.
Oh.
Exactly.
Hmm. Yeah. This is, and it's there's so many theories, and I get into some of that stuff in some of the other interviews. Like I've been talking to Dr. Cheryl White. I'm going to have her back on
Yes.
again too, talking about some of the potential evidence to connect up the shroud with the Mendelian, and so we get into different topics here. But I we have a couple minutes left here, some good time to share
Hmm.
with both of you. So I just thought I'd open it up and see if there's anything else in particular, that you really like to share with people, if anything, for any presentations you give that you'd like to spend a little extra time on that really seems to connect with people and help them think this sort of thing through.
As I've given this presentation, one of the things that I have developed, it didn't come naturally. It came because I kept trying to understand things. And what I learned was that ancient Hebrew is pictographic. Every letter has a picture meaning to it. And the first thing I read along those lines was Barashit, in the beginning. And in the beginning, Barashit, if you look at the Hebrew letters, it reads, the Son of God crushed his hand on a cross. Whoa.
Hmm.
Sounds to me like Revelation, the lamb slain before the foundation of the world. Well, let's
Yeah.
look a little further. It's Barashit Elohim Aleph Tav. But the Aleph Tav is not translated in our English Bible. What is Aleph Tav? Behold, I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end.
Hmm.
The Aleph Tav.
Yeah.
Whoa, it didn't stop there. Then I really started looking. The unpronounceable name, Yod He Vav He. Behold the hand, behold the nail. Is it getting firm? I was about to walk away from the Shroud years ago because of the attacks of people like Josh McDowell, because my book was written,
Hmm.
because I got attacked from many different fronts by people that just didn't want to believe. They couldn't accept the
Right.
fact that this could possibly be Jesus' burial cloth. I remember saying that, the shroud is not necessarily a part of my faith. I accepted Christ without the shroud. So therefore I don't need it. I'm glad to have seen it, touched it, and written about it and so forth. And then my wife encouraged me to reread Isaiah 52. Well, you've read Nazah. The word
Hmm.
Nazah is right there in Isaiah 52, and it means to startle and to sprinkle.
Hmm.
And the scripture says that they'll see his marred face and his marred body, and it's going to startle and sprinkle them. Kings will shut their mouths. what had not been told them shall they see. And so I immediately
Hmm.
thought, no, wait a minute. Paul said, King Festus, you know about this. So if it's future kings, it's got to be future to Paul at the very least, because they knew
Right.
about it. Now, where is the picture of his marred face and marred body? And then I went a step
Yeah.
further. What is Nazah? Ancient
Hmm.
Hebrew says, behold, the heir to the throne pierced. Sounds like Zechariah to me. They're going to look on the one they've
Yeah.
pierced.
Yeah.
And so it's things like
Yeah.
that that I have added over the years to my presentation. I don't just, and I mean, I could go on. The purposes of linen in Scripture, how linen is used in Scripture, and how it matches, the feast days, and how they line up. You start putting all these
Yeah.
things together, and you have too much for coincidence, way too much for
Right.
coincidence. And I'll add one more thing. I had been invited by a classmate of mine and another Air Force Academy graduate from an earlier class. I was invited to Boston to speak at their church. It was wonderful. The earlier grad put me in a beautiful, he had like, I don't know what you would call it, like a guest house behind his home. And it was there that I discovered what I just mentioned to you about Nazah, that it meant the heir to the throne pierced. And so I had a beautiful meeting there, and I came back home. I wasn't home too long before he wrote me and said, "Hey, have you seen this book, The Karamayan Lost and Found?" Well, I had never heard of the Karamayan. I had heard of the
Hmm.
Mandelian, or however you want to pronounce
Yeah.
it. I hadn't heard of the Karamayan. Mandelian, Karamayan, same thing. Image of Edessa, same thing. So I get the
Hmm.
book and I read it, and this guy who's an amateur archaeologist goes to Turkey and finds what he is convinced is the stone recorded as being where they found the shroud in a niche above the wall after the flood. And he
Ah.
writes a whole book on it. So I write the publisher, Morgan James, and I said, if you did his book, you're going to want my book. And I sent him the copy of Nazah. Morgan James published Nazah. So
Wow.
again, too many coincidences. Who was it? The famous baseball player says, too much coincidence is not a coincidence.
Well, I got to share this with you because this is so funny. Just today, and for folks watching this or listening, we had to reschedule this because I was sick a few weeks back, so this wasn't even the original day we were going to do this. We were finding different dates that worked for everybody, and I had a personal day today, and just shifting things around. I was going to do it last week. I was going to do it today. All these other things that happened to be this morning, and one of them was a visit to a friend of mine who's a priest. He lives about an hour away. He married my wife and I. Haven't seen him in a long time, and so I go down and meet with him, and I'm leaving. And the main church is closed. They're doing renovations and stuff. I was just on my way out. I said, "Hey, can I pop in there?" He said, "Well, no, it's locked up." But the old church down the street, they have that open for anyone that wants to go in there. So all of these just fortuitous things that lead me to go in there. And I walk in. There's one gentleman in there, and he's just an older gentleman. He's up there praying, and he was actually in the middle, like a phone call had come in right before I came in, and he was alone, so he took it. But as soon as he saw me, he got embarrassed. He finished up, and he's apologizing to me. And I said, "Oh, no worries. I'm just popping in, and then I'm gonna be on the road." And I get ready to leave, and he just introduces himself, and he says his name, and then he says, "I do Shroud of Turin talks. That's what I do. Have you ever?" He says, "Have you ever heard of it?" And I just said, "This is, like I'm looking up the picture of our Lord." I was like, "You have to be kidding me!" And so we only talked for 30 seconds, but I just said, this, and I go out to the car, and I'm just laughing the whole way. I said, "Okay." All right. So some
It's
people would
funny.
just laugh at that and say, "Oh, that's superstition." I'm like, well, I don't know. Or is there more to it?
There is so much more to it. I'm not giving Brian much time to speak. I could tell you
No, please,
things that have
please.
happened, but this one really got me. About a year ago, I got an email from a lady in London, and she shared with me how she had seen Verdict on the Shroud as a young girl in a bookstore. She ran home, broke open her piggy bank, jumped on her bicycle, rode back down to the bookstore and bought it. She came back, she read it, she gave her heart to the Lord. Her dad bought her a Bible, and a few years later, she created a website on the Shroud for children.
Oh, wow.
Now, here's the thing about that. I could tell you at least 3 stories like that I'm aware of where someone that I would least expect or not even know, and I gave a presentation or this or that, and boom, God used it. But you never know what is going to be the result. I stood in an
Amen.
airport waiting to catch a plane back to IBM. Like I said, God gave me flying back after 3 years. And so I was returning. We had left a corporate jet there. I was returning commercial. But I often took copies of the book with me because I never knew who I was going to meet on the road. So
Right.
over the years, I gave books to Charlie Pride, Dionne Warwick, just a number of people would go, wow, you did? Yeah, I
Yeah.
did. Autographed them. I'm waiting
Denzel
for this
Washington, I
plane.
believe, as well.
Oh,
Huh?
yeah? Oh, wow.
I believe Denzel Washington as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, Denzel as well. But in
Wow.
this airport, I'm waiting, and there's the late Howard Cosell. And
Mm.
people are besieging him. Howard, what about this fight? Howard, what about? And I could tell the poor guy's exhausted, right? And so finally they call our plane, and so people leave him alone. And we're on the same plane. So I walk up to him, and he kind of gets a little nervous. I said, I'm not going to ask you for anything. I'm going to give you something. I autographed a copy of the book and gave it to him. Well, they
Mm.
called first class first, so he was in. When I came through first class and went back to my nice coach seat, he was clutching that book to his chest like it was the most precious thing he had ever been given. You
Wow.
don't know. You have no
Yeah.
idea. So Paul Newman had come to shoot a movie at our church and school in New York, and our children went to see him. It was really great, and I brought a copy of the book to him. And he asked me why I was doing this with the kids. I said, these children deserve a good education and so on and so forth. But he took that book and he just, with tears in his eyes, he said, you're doing something good. And then I don't think it was 45 minutes after he drove off the site that I got a call from Newman's Own. And he gave the first of several gifts to our ministry. So the
Mm.
point I'm making is you never know how it's going to affect somebody or what it's going to do in their life. We've been privileged to see, to touch, to study what is arguably the most important artifact of all time. And I think we're remiss unless we tell people what we've seen.
Hmm. Well said. Well,
Yeah.
let me just I want to give you both just the floor here just to kind of any key takeaways, closing remarks, just advice for anyone listening or watching this, what a good next step might be wherever they're at when it comes to how to pursue this question of the shroud.
Well, one of the things which we have recently developed is over the past year, Dr. Stevenson and I co-authored a book. Uh, the book is currently available on our website. The title of the book is The Shroud of Turin,
Hmm.
The Perfect Summary. The entire purpose of the book is to relay much of the information which we shared today with the audience, but relay it in a very, I don't want to use this word,
Mm-hmm.
reader-friendly fashion, if you will. What I mean by that is I want the reader to not assume they have to have a background in chemistry
Right.
or science or archaeology or history to
Mhm.
understand this. It's written in a very reader-friendly
Accessible. Yeah.
manner.
Yes.
Part of it was even written as, part of it's even, when we talk about the chain of custody, for example, that's even written as kind of a lighthearted fairy tale,
I
but it's a
like
very
that.
accurate one. So when people
Yeah.
read that, they would read it and
Yeah.
say, "Oh, this is funny." They would read it and say, "Oh, I
Right.
get it. This just makes sense." So I would
Yeah.
heartily encourage everyone to visit our website, which is www.theshroudofturin, Turin is spelled TURIN.org. That's www.theshroudofturin.org. In addition, the book which we authored, we determined we would just want to get this into the hands of as many people as possible. We have already translated the book into 4 languages. The book is available in English, in Hebrew, in Italian, and in Spanish. All of those versions are available, and you can get your free copy at our website, www.theshroudofturin.org/freebook, FREEBOOK.
And I'll have those
I would
links below
also
and everything. So, yep,
suggest that
absolutely.
I think it's very
Excellent.
important that people begin to see the evidence. And what I mean by that is, even in a book, you get 5th, 6th, 7th generation images. It's not the same. It's one of the reasons why I speak all over the place. If I get invited, I'm going to go and speak. And so I do make myself available to give presentations. Dr. Brian is preparing to start giving presentations as well. We do want to get this book around the world. Right now it's in 51 countries, but that leaves us about 140 more to go, or whatever the current count is. We also have 4 states to go. Come on, guys.
Which ones, if you don't mind me asking?
The Dakotas,
Vermont, North Dakota,
New Hampshire,
Okay.
and Vermont.
That's it.
Yeah.
Okay.
They're both Dakotas. So if you
We
guys know
probably got
anybody in those
viewers
areas,
out there somewhere.
Get it. I'm sure.
Yep.
It'll change your life. I promise you it'll change your life.
There's a lot of great information there, and I can't thank you both enough so much for sharing your time here and all the rescheduling we had to do. It's just been an honor and a blessing to talk to both of you, and keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you.
Thanks for having
us aboard.
Yep. That was truly my honor, a tremendous delight to speak with both these gentlemen, and a lot of food for thought, a lot of really interesting things to take into consideration. As always, with anything we talk about with the Shroud, I just want to reemphasize here again that it's no surprise to anyone who's seen this channel before that, in my personal opinion, I really do believe, as I think Father Andrew Dalton has put it really well lately, that to think of the Shroud as perhaps this artifact that bears what you could call physical evidence, physical residual effects of a supernatural event. I personally believe that it is the burial shroud of Jesus, and that Jesus' resurrection is what produced the image, and that the other tangible physical things that we see on the shroud, like the blood and the pollens and all those kinds of things, all serve for a deeper meditation on the sufferings of Christ and the great joy of the resurrection. But granted, a lot of our viewers, a lot of our listeners might have a different opinion, might have a different view, and there is a lot of debate. And so I always encourage that. I encourage you to leave comments below, but also feel free to reach out to me through my website if you want, thegraciousguest.org. You can contact me directly that way, and sometimes comments are just too long, and I can't get to all of them on there. Once in a while, comments are not really productive or friendly, that sort of thing. I might have to deal with those, but by and large, I've been very, very thankful and very blessed that these conversations that a lot of these interviews have generated have led to some fruit, and I really enjoy speaking with all of you as best I can, though it is difficult to get to everybody on there. So feel free to leave a comment below. Like I said, visit thegraciousguest.org, my website, if you want to contact me directly or get more information, more resources for all the things we do here on The Gracious Guest. So, and definitely check out all of those links below for sure to all of the work that Dr. Stevenson and Dr. Worrell are doing when it comes to the Shroud. God bless you all. Thank you for stopping by. Subscribe, share this far and wide, like all this content, help me get this channel spreading as much as we can and growing. And until next time, don't forget to wonder. Take care.